The horse went lame 2 miles south of the canyon rim, and Clara Voss had exactly three choices. Leave the animal, go back to Harlan's Crossing, or walk. She walked. The moon was three-quarters full, and the Texas hill country was silver and black under it. The cedar scrub casting hard shadows across the Kalish Road. The air smelling of juniper and something faintly like metal. The smell of dry lightning working somewhere to the north. She had $22 sewn into the lining of her coat, a Remington derringer in her right boot, and a folded oilskin packet tucked tight against her ribs under the wool. The packet was the thing that mattered. The money and the pistol were just cents. She had been a telegraph operator for 6 years. First in St. Louis, then in Laredo, then for the past 14 months at the Harlan's Crossing Depot, where the Texas and Pacific line came through on its way toward Del Rio. She had sent and received 10,000 messages in that time. Cattle counts, land transfers, freight manifests, wedding announcements, death notifications, the ordinary and the extraordinary moving alike, through the wire at 15 words a minute. And she had read every one of them, the way the job required, professionally accurately, and without any particular opinion about what they contained. Until the March messages. Until the series of telegrams sent between Hollis Draper of the Draper Land Company in Harlan's Crossing and a man named Cabot in Austin, describing in the careful language of men who believed themselves beyond consequence the method by which 17 homestead families on the Perdido Creek drainage had been stripped of their water rights, their deeds forged, their survey lines altered, and their properties either seized for tax default or purchased under extreme duress for a tenth of assessed value. She had copied those messages into a ledger. All 23 of them, dates and times in the exact language of each transmission, cross-referenced against the land transfer records she'd been able to access from the county recorder's office. She had done it carefully over 4 months, saying nothing to anyone. She had been engaged to Hollis Draper's eldest son for 2 of those months. That was the complicated part. The town of Vaca Springs was 11 miles from where she'd left the horse, and by the time the first gray suggestion of dawn appeared above the eastern escarpment, her feet had given her their opinion on the matter in terms she could not ignore. She stopped at a dry wash and sat on a boulder and took off her left boot to address the blister that had been communicating its grievances for the past 3 miles. The derringer was in the right boot. She kept that one on. She sat on the boulder and looked at the sky going from black to iron to a thin pale gold above the hills, and she was not precisely frightened. Fear was a thing she'd had in the first week after she'd understood what the messages meant, a low, cold dread that sat behind her sternum and made sleep difficult. That phase had passed. What she had now was something more functional: alertness, the particular quality of attention that comes when you know what you're dealing with and have decided to deal with it. Hollis Draper had held every significant piece of property in a 2-county radius for 20 years. He had the county judge's ear and the county sheriff's salary, effectively speaking. He had 3 sons, 2 of whom worked for him directly, and one of whom, Miles the eldest, the handsome one with the easy smile she had been engaged to for 8 weeks before she'd understood what the family business actually was. She had kept the ring when she left. It was a good ring, her grandmother's pearl reset in yellow gold, which Miles had given her because it seemed like the appropriate romantic gesture, and which she'd recognized even then as a thing borrowed from someone else's story. She had kept it not out of sentiment, but because it was worth $40, and $40 might matter. The sun came up over the hills with the serious intention of a Texas summer, and she put her boot back on and kept walking. She reached Vaca Springs as the town was opening itself to the day. The blacksmith's fire already lit the smell of fry bread from the Mexican cantina at the corner of Calle Primero, a dog moving with great dignity across the Caliche Main Street toward an appointment only it understood. The stage depot was on the north end of the street. She needed the stage north to Uvalde, and from Uvalde, the train to San Antonio, where the district land office was, and where a federal deputy surveyor named Graves had been corresponding with the Perdido Creek families about their claims. She'd been corresponding with Graves herself indirectly through a woman in Uvalde named Cressida Marsh, who had helped organize the homesteader family's petition. It was Cressida's name she'd used when she'd sent Graves the initial account. It was Cressida who'd told her 3 weeks ago that Graves was ready to open a formal inquiry, but needed original documents. Clara had the original documents. She had the stage fare in her pocket and the receipt for a seat already purchased. She'd done that 2 days ago quietly, the way she'd done everything in the past 4 months. The stage north departed at 8 in the morning. It was 7:45 when she reached the depot. The stage was there. The horses were being changed. A woman with 2 children was already seated inside, and a stout man in a traveling suit was arguing mildly with the depot agent about something. Clara paid for her bag to be loaded and was about to climb in when she noticed the horse. Not the stage horses. The horse tied at the depot rail, a big gray with a Ranger brand on the left hip, travel-worn, sweated up and still breathing hard, which meant its rider had come in at speed sometime in the last hour. A good horse, she noted, automatically even exhausted. The kind of horse that cost real money and had been chosen for endurance rather than show. She did not know then whose horse it was. She got into the stage. She learned whose horse it was 3 hours later when the stage stopped at the Blanco River crossing to water the team, and she got out to stretch her legs and found him sitting on a cottonwood log at the river's edge, his hat on the ground beside him, his boots off his feet in the water, eating cold biscuits from a cloth sack with the unhurried concentration of a man who had not eaten in some time. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, long through the legs and through the jaw, with the kind of lean that comes from spending more calories than you take in for months on end. Brown hair gone to redness in the sun. A scar above his left eyebrow that was old enough to be purely cosmetic. His face was the kind you couldn't read from a distance. It didn't announce anything, didn't lean toward friendliness or hostility, just occupied its own space with the flat patience of a man who had learned to wait. He glanced up when she came down to the bank. Measured, not unfriendly, just the assessment of someone whose habit was to know who was around him. "Seat on the stage," she said. "Same." He looked back at the river. "You're riding the stage, and that's your gray at the depot." "Gray's lame in the off for," he said. "I'm leaving her with the stableman to bring on when she mends." He ate another biscuit. "Didn't know I was being monitored." "You weren't. I notice horses." She came down to the water's edge and cupped some in her palm and drank. It was cold and clean, and she was thirsty enough not to mind the silt. "Where are you headed, Uvalde?" She straightened up and looked at him more carefully. He had a Colt on his right hip, the kind of wear on the holster that came from years of daily use rather than occasional show. His coat on the log beside him showed the shape of something in the inside pocket, a badge possibly, or papers. "What kind of business?" she asked. She was not ordinarily a woman who made conversation with strangers at river crossings, but something about the direction of his travel aligned with a particular question in her mind. He looked at her. His eyes were a color she couldn't determine in the hard noon light, something between gray and dark like water over limestone. "The kind that's mine," he said. Flat, not rude, just a fact he was setting down. "Fair enough." She went back up the bank. "Haswamam, Dainin Shisham Disham." His name was Holt Greer. She learned this from the stage manifest when she looked at it during the noon rest at Hondo. The stage agent had left it on the forward seat when he'd gone to deal with a wheel pin, and she'd looked at it because looking at things was how she'd spent 6 years, and the name at the top was one she'd seen before. She had sent a message for a Holt Greer 4 months ago. A message from the Texas Ranger office in Austin addressed to a ranch in Uvalde County, informing Holt Greer that the warrant for his arrest, in connection with the burning of the Draper Land Company's storage barn in Harlan's Crossing, had been issued by Burnett County, and that he was required to appear. She had read that message and filed it and thought nothing of it because that was her job. Now she thought about it. She sat across from him in the stage the family with the 2 children had gotten off at Hondo, and it was just the 2 of them and the stout traveling salesman who had fallen asleep almost immediately, and she looked at the hill country going past the window, the cedar and limestone and the long afternoon light, and she thought about what she knew. The Draper Land Company's storage barn had been burned in late January. Hollis Draper had told the sheriff it was arson, and he had told the sheriff who'd done it, and the sheriff being the sheriff Hollis Draper effectively owned had issued the warrant without remarkable investigation. The 3 families who'd been watching the Draper storage yard that night all worked for Draper. Their testimony was what it was. What Clara also knew, because she had that same week received and filed a message from a homesteader's wife on Perdido Creek asking the Telegraph Association to confirm whether messages could be subpoenaed in a legal proceeding, was that Holt Greer's family had been one of the 17 on the Perdido Creek drainage. His father had run cattle on 160 acres of that creek bottom for 15 years, and the Draper Land Company had acquired that land the previous September for back taxes owed. The taxes had been assessed at 3 times the county average on a property that had been tax current since 1865. She looked at the man across from her. He was awake, looking out his own window, his hat on his knee, his profile expressionless against the moving landscape. He had the particular quality of stillness she associated with men who spent significant time alone. Not restlessness suppressed, but genuine quiet, the kind that had learned to fill itself. She thought about what she was carrying, and about the direction he was going, and about the thing in his inside pocket, and she made a calculation of the kind she had been making in various forms for 4 months. Greer, she said. He looked at her. I think we may have business in common. He studied her for a moment, that flat measuring study. I don't know you. My name is Clara Voss. I was the telegraph operator at Harlan's Crossing. She paused. I sent you a message in January about a warrant. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, just a shifting of the elements like a deck of cards cut and rearranged into a new order. He was looking at her with a different kind of attention now. You read the messages you send. Everyone reads the messages they send. That's how sending works. You remember them. I remember the ones that matter. A pause, the salesman snored gently. The stage jolted over a limestone outcrop, and both of them grabbed the seat rail by instinct. What kind of common business, he said. She reached inside her coat and felt the oilskin packet against her ribs. She did not take it out. Not yet. Hollis Draper, she said. The Perdido Creek land transfers, and a man in Austin named Cabot who has been filing amended survey maps for properties he's never set foot on. Holt Greer was very still. I have 23 messages, she said. Dates, times, exact wording, cross-referenced against the county register. She kept her voice even. And I am going to Uvalde to give them to a federal deputy surveyor who is building a case. He looked at her for a long time. The limestone hills rolled past the window gold and white in the afternoon sun. You were working for Draper, he said. I was employed at the depot in his town. That's different. He'd see it the same way. I know he would. She met his eyes. That's why I left on foot at 2 in the morning. Something shifted in his expression. Something she couldn't name, but which had the quality of a calculation resolving. He looked at the window at the hills and then back at her. How long have you been sitting on those messages? 4 months. Why didn't you go sooner? I needed the county register records to cross-reference. The recorder's office only gave access to public documents once a month for copying. She paused. And I needed to know who to bring them to. I needed to know the federal channel was open before I showed my hand. He was quiet. His thumb moved against the brim of his hat, a slow, absent motion. Graves, he said. You know him. I know about him. A homesteader named Albrecht from the creek wrote to me. Said Graves was the only honest man in the land office in a 3-state radius. He looked at her again. How did Draper find out you were leaving? I don't know that he did. You came out at 2 in the morning on foot. That was a precaution. He gave her a look that she correctly interpreted as skepticism, politely restrained. Miss Voss, if you've had those messages for 4 months and you were engaged to his son, he may have had someone watching. The word engaged hit differently than she'd expected, not the fact of it, which she'd carried for months, but hearing it said by this man in this light. It made it feel briefly real again in a way it hadn't been in weeks. She looked at the window. That's possible, she said. Were you engaged to Miles Draper or Hollis Draper's operation? Miles, she paused, though in retrospect the distinction may be academic. When did you break it off? Last night, by absence. She kept her voice level. I left the ring on the telegraph counter and walked out. Holt Greer looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working something out, not about her specifically, but about the situation, the way a man works out a problem that has become larger and more complicated than he'd estimated. If they're watching the stage lines, he said, you'd want someone to know you have what you have, so that taking you out of the picture doesn't also take the evidence out. I've thought about that. Have you made a copy? A partial one, with Mrs. Marsh in Uvalde. She looked at him. Why are you going to Uvalde? He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a folded document. He handed it across. She unfolded it and read the Ranger letterhead, the case number, the careful language of a formal investigation into the Burnett County warrant. Someone in the Ranger office had been doing their own work. She looked up at him. They're reviewing the arson charge. Reviewing is a word for it. He took the document back. What they actually have is a statement from a Mexican sheep herder who was grazing on the Draper property boundary that night and saw 2 of Draper's own men start that fire. He folded the document. Man named Ruiz. He went to the Rangers because Draper's sons threatened his flock last spring, and he'd had enough. Clara thought about that, about the specific alignment of evidence, his testimony exonerating Holt, her telegrams, implicating Hollis, and about what it would mean if those two pieces arrived at the same federal desk at the same time. Then we're going to the same place for the same reason, she said. He looked at her with something that might in a different man's face have been called wry. It appears so. Mr. Greer. Holt. She looked at him for a moment. The hills were going golden in the late light, the cedar casting long shadows across the Kalishi, the land enormous and hot and serious in the Texas afternoon. Clara, she said. He nodded once. He looked out the window. The salesman snored on. The stage rolled north through the limestone hills, and Clara kept her hand rested near the top button of her coat, where she could feel the oilskin packet, and across from her, Holt Greer watched the country with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned that the land would tell you things if you knew how to look. She thought about what she'd left and about where she was going, and about the man across from her, and about the peculiar way that circumstances arrange themselves sometimes into shapes that almost look like intention. Then she thought, don't be sentimental. You have evidence to deliver and a warrant to clear and a land fraud case to make. And that is enough for one woman on one stage heading north in the Texas summer. She looked out her window. The sun was going down behind the western hills, burning them orange and red at the edges, and the sky above was deepening from pale gold to something darker and more serious. And it was one of the most beautiful things she had seen since she'd arrived in Texas, and she had learned to notice beauty without letting it slow her down. She did not think about Holt Greer's hands, which were long-fingered and capable-looking, and rested on his knee with the complete relaxation of a man at ease in his own body. She did not think about that at all. They reached Uvalde as the sun hit the horizon, the stage rolling down the main street with the usual clatter and dust, and Clara was first out of the door because she had been thinking for the last hour about the order of operations. She needed Cressida Marsh, then Graves, then somewhere to sleep that wasn't visible from the main road. What she found was Cressida Marsh on the depot platform waiting for her with an expression that made her stomach drop. Cressida was 50 years old and built like a woman who had been doing hard work her whole life, with white hair worn in a practical knot, and the expression of someone who had not slept the previous night. She grabbed Clara's arm before Clara had fully stepped down and pulled her to the side away from the other passengers. "How many people knew you were coming on this stage?" Cressida said very quietly. "No one. I bought the ticket under a different name at the Vaca Springs Depot." "Draper's man came through here at noon," Cressida said. "Weston, the one with the red beard. He went to Graves's office at the Land Bureau and talked to him for an hour." She kept her voice down. "Then he went to the telegraph office and sent 3 messages." Clara felt the particular cold that meant the situation had become faster than she'd planned for. "Did Graves talk to him?" "I don't know. Graves hasn't sent word." Cressida's eyes moved over Clara's shoulder and came back. "Is that who I think it is?" Clara looked back. Holt Greer was at the stage collecting a saddlebag from the boot, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who didn't broadcast his intentions. "He's on our side," Clara said. "You know that. I know enough." She watched him close the saddlebag and loop it over his shoulder. "He's the Greer from Perdido Creek, the one with the warrant." Cressida was quiet for a moment. "I see," she said in a tone that Clara decided she didn't have time to interpret right now. "I need to get to Graves before Weston's messages arrive and change whatever arrangement Graves is working under," Clara said. "Where is he?" "His house. He won't go back to the office tonight. Weston rattled him, I think. He's a good man, but not a brave one." "A good man is enough. Can you take me there?" "I can take both of you," Cressida said, "if he's coming." Clara looked at Holt. He had paused at the edge of the platform and was looking at her, waiting, she understood, to take his direction from whatever she said next, which she found striking in a man who appeared to be entirely capable of directing himself. He was giving her the precedence. She thought about why. "Because it's your evidence," she realized. "He knows that. He's deferring to the packet." She crossed the platform to him. "Cressida Marsh. She knows where Graves is. We should go tonight." He looked at her steadily. "You trust her?" "She's been coordinating the homesteaders' petition for 2 years and risked her general store's credit to do it." "Yes." He looked at Cressida, a measuring look that was not unkind. Cressida looked back with the expression of a woman who was not easily measured. "All right," he said. They went. Thomas Graves was a slight man of 55 with ink-stained fingers and the careful demeanor of someone who had spent a career doing accurate work in a system that did not always reward accuracy. He had a small house on the edge of Uvalde proper, set back from the road behind a live oak tree, and when Cressida knocked, he opened the door with the expression of a man who had been expecting something like this, even if not precisely this. He looked at Clara, he looked at Holt. He looked at the oilskin packet that Clara was already opening. "Come in," he said. They sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours. Clara spread the messages across the table in sequence and walked him through each one date time sender recipient and what the specific language documented about the Perdido Creek fraud. Graves read each one with the close attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and its implications for a federal case. He asked questions that were precise and practical. He had a ledger of his own, the homesteader's depositions, the original plat surveys, the amended filings with their forged signatures, and he went through it against her messages, systematically building the correspondence. Holt sat to one side and said little. Once when Graves asked about the barn-burning charge, and Clara began to explain, Holt took over and laid it out himself. The Ruiz statement, the Ranger's review, the legal status of the warrant. He spoke clearly and without dramatics, the way a man speaks when he's been through something and wants the other person to understand it accurately rather than impressively. At midnight, Graves set his pen down and looked at what was in front of him. "This is enough," he said. "With the depositions I already have and what you've brought, this is enough for a federal injunction on all 17 properties and an indictment referral for Hollis, Draper, and Cabot both." He looked at Clara. "You've been carrying this for 4 months. I needed the register copies. You were engaged to his son. That was a separate matter." She kept her voice level. "The information is the information." Graves looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized as respect, wearing the clothes of mild disbelief. "I'll need you to swear an affidavit tomorrow. Both of you." He looked at Holt. "Your testimony about the warrant and the Ruiz statement corroborates the context of the land fraud. The Ranger's review of the arson charge will need to go into the record." He paused. "The warrant is effectively voided by the new evidence, but formally it needs to go through the district judge in San Antonio." "How long?" Holt said. "Weeks, possibly longer." Graves looked at the mess of documents on his table. "In the meantime, you should both be careful. If Weston's messages were to Hollis Draper, he knows you're here." Clara looked at the documents. 14 months of work, 23 messages, 1 oilskin packet. She felt something she had been holding for 4 months released slightly, not entirely, not until the injunction was filed and the affidavit was sworn and Graves had it all in the federal record, but slightly. "Where are you staying tonight?" Cressida asked her. "I hadn't thought that far." "My spare room. No negotiation in it." She looked at Holt. "I'll find a place." He stood and put on his hat. He looked at Clara. "I'll be at the federal office at 8. "I'll be there at 7, she said. Something moved in his face, that same thing she'd seen in the stage, the card deck being rearranged. 7, he said. He left. Clara sat at Graves's kitchen table a moment longer and looked at the documents. Her documents, the things she'd built over 4 months of careful solitary work, and felt them pass into something larger than herself, which was what they were supposed to do. She was not frightened. She had said that before to herself, and sometimes it was almost true. Tonight, it was almost entirely true. She rode to Cressida's house in the dark, with her hand loose at her coat front, and above the live oaks the stars were extraordinary, the way Texas stars were pressing down to the horizon without a city's light to thin them, the Milky Way as clear as a road you could follow if you knew which direction you were going. She knew which direction she was going. She just hadn't fully mapped what was at the end of it. She thought about Holt Greer's face across Graves' kitchen table, the precision of his account, the way he'd let her lead and held his own knowledge in reserve until it was needed, the quality of his attention during her 3 hours of documentation. She thought about what it meant that his father's land was among the 17 and that he was here going through the same federal channel and that neither of them had known the other was coming until a river crossing in the noon heat. She went to bed in Cressida's spare room and slept finally without the weight behind her sternum and did not dream of anything she could remember in the morning. The affidavits took 2 days. Graves was thorough to the point of slowness, which Clara understood was not a flaw, but a feature. A federal case built carelessly was a federal case lost at appeal, and she had not spent 4 months in careful construction to see it undone by haste. She sat across from his desk on both mornings and answered his questions in order without embellishment, the way she'd learned to do everything important precisely with the confidence that the facts themselves were enough. Holt came each morning at 7 and sat in the wooden chair against the wall while she worked through the telegraph logs, and when Graves turned to him in the afternoons, he gave his account with the same economy. The Ruiz affidavit had arrived by wire from the ranger office the first evening Graves had requested it, and whoever was handling the review had sent it same day, which meant the rangers were moving faster than Holt had expected. He told her this in the hallway outside Graves' office, and she saw in his face a thing she hadn't seen there before, something that looked like relief, careful and not quite trusted. "Your father's land," she said, 160 acres on the east fork of Perdido Creek. He was quiet for a moment. His hat was in his hands. He put 15 years into that water channel, cut it himself from the limestone one summer at a time. The injunction will freeze all 17 transfers. Draper can't sell or encumber any of the properties while the federal case is active. I know. He looked at her. I'm not expecting to get it back. The legal recovery process on seized homesteads takes years and the odds aren't good. He turned the hat brim in his fingers, the same absent motion she'd noticed in the stage. I just wanted on record what was done, what he took and how. She understood that, the need for the record independent of the outcome. She had been making that record for 4 months, and it was not nothing that Graves would be filing it in the Federal Archive, where it could be accessed and cited and built upon by anyone who came after. It will be, she said, on record. He looked at her for a moment, and she had learned enough in 2 days to know that when he held her gaze like that, it meant he was saying something he found difficult to say with words. She waited. Thank you, he said finally, for the messages, for going back for the register copies, for all of it. She looked at the wall beside him. She was not ordinarily a woman who had difficulty with being thanked. You're welcome, she said. She went back into Graves' office before either of them could say anything further. The town of Uvalde was not large, but it had the character of a place that had decided to take itself seriously. A proper brick courthouse, a dry goods operation of some scope, a hotel with a dining room that served actual food rather than the approximate suggestion of it. Clara had moved from Cressida's spare room to the hotel on the second day because Cressida's spare room was above her general store, and Cressida had enough exposure already without adding Clara's to it. She had also moved because the spare room looked east, and the early light came through the thin curtains at 5 in the morning, and she had been awake before the light anyway, lying on her back thinking about the case, and about Hollis Draper's reach, and about all the things that could go wrong between a federal affidavit and a federal conviction. Holt was at the hotel too. She'd seen his name in the register when she checked in. He'd taken a room on the second floor, one door from her own, the only other room occupied on that end of the hall. She had noted this and not noted it with equal parts of her mind, which was a thing she was doing more and more often. On the third morning, she came down to the dining room before 6 and found him already there at the corner table with his back to the wall and a cup of coffee and what looked like a county survey map spread across most of the table. He looked up when she came in. Couldn't sleep, she said. Rarely do. He moved the map to make room. It was not precisely an invitation, but she sat down across from him because the alternative was one of the tables in the middle of the room with its back to the door, and she had developed opinions about that kind of thing in the past week. The map was of Uvalde County and the surrounding territory, hand-drawn and annotated in pencil, in a hand that was not Holt's older lines faded with newer marks in a darker pencil overlaid. Yours, she asked. My father's. He drew it when he first came out here. He turned it so she could see it right side up. The marks in dark are mine. I've been looking at the water situation. She looked at the map. The dark pencil marks were along a river system that came down from the northwest, a tributary of the Frio. She thought the one that ran through the northwest corner of the county. Several sections were outlined in pencil with question marks. Whose land is that section? She said, pointing to the largest outlined area. Right now, nobody's. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. There was a homesteader there named Farnham who left for Colorado in '76. The property lapsed to the state for taxes owed, and the state sold it at auction in '77. He paused. I bid on it, lost to a Draper proxy. She looked at him. Draper has that section too. He has it the same way he has the Perdido Creek properties. The auction was rigged, the proxy was bidding with a forged letter of credit. I didn't know that until Albrecht wrote me. He took a drink of his coffee. If the federal injunction covers properties acquired by fraudulent means, that section might come back available. It would have to go through the land office review, but if the proxy's letter of credit was forged, that's fraud in the original transfer. Yes, she studied the map. The section he was looking at sat on the Frio tributary's main flow, good water if the drought cycles didn't get bad. What would you do with it? He was quiet for a moment. Raise cattle, build something. He looked at the map the way she'd seen him look at the hill country from the stage window, with the patient attention of a man reading a language he understood. My father's place is gone. I've been working other men's spreads for 8 months. I'd like land that's mine. 160 acres. It's what the Homestead Act allows. Is it enough to make it work? With water access, yes. The Frio tributary runs reliable through that section 11 months out of 12. He glanced at her. Why? I'm asking because I'll be in the affidavit record as the primary witness on the Draper land transfers, and if there's a subsequent inquiry into that specific property, I want to understand the situation. She kept her voice even. So I know what I'm saying if someone asks. He looked at her steadily. That's a practical reason. I try to have those. The cook came out with eggs and bread, and they ate mostly in silence, which she had noticed was not uncomfortable with him. The silences had a texture to them that was different from the silences of people who didn't have anything to say and were managing around the fact. He was thinking. She was thinking. They occupied the same space without requiring it to be filled. She ate and looked at the map and thought about what she was going to do after Graves filed the injunction. She did not have a plan that extended beyond San Antonio. In St. Louis, she had a second cousin who had never particularly liked her. In Laredo, she had a former landlady who might take her in for a week. She had $22 and a pearl ring and a skill set that was worth a job anywhere there was a telegraph line, which was most places of any size. She was 31 years old, and she had been, for 14 months, reasonably certain she was building something. A position, a household, a life in a specific place. The engagement to Miles Draper had been a practical decision, which she'd known at the time. She'd liked him well enough. He was genuinely charming in the way of men who have been told from childhood that charm was a tool, and she'd told herself that liking was enough, that warmth came with time, that the kitchen table kind of life was the kind you built through habit and intention and not just feeling. She had not been wrong exactly. She had been incomplete. What she had not accounted for in her practical calculations was that she had been building her life around not being seen rather than around being seen, around the management of what she knew and what she revealed and what she kept back, around the careful performance of a woman who was exactly what the situation required. She thought about that now over eggs and bread in the Uvalde Hotel dining room, and she thought about how different it was to sit with a man who looked at her the way Holt Greer looked at her, as though she were a fact he was reading accurately without needing her to be simpler than she was. She looked at the map. She did not think about that any further. The fourth day in Uvalde brought news from Cressida, delivered by her boy at the hotel desk. Weston had come back. He'd been at the stage depot the previous evening, asking questions about recent arrivals, and he'd been at the hotel that morning asking the desk clerk the same. Cressida's note was brief and factual. She was not a woman who added alarm to information, but the fact of it was its own alarm. Clara read the note in the hallway outside her room and went down the back stairs to find Holt. He was in the hotel stable looking at a bay gelding he'd apparently just bought or was considering buying, running his hand along the animal's foreleg with the focused attention he gave to anything he was assessing. He heard her on the stable floor and turned. She gave him the note. He read it. He handed it back. His face was the careful face, the one that didn't broadcast. How much longer does Graves need? He said today, the injunction papers go to San Antonio by tomorrow's stage. She folded the note. But he needs me to review the final affidavit before he files it. How long will that take? 2 hours, maybe 3. He looked at the gelding. I'll be outside his office. You don't have to. Weston has been with the Draper outfit for 12 years, he said. He's the one who served the eviction papers on the Perdido Creek families. He knocked an old man named Pacheco off his front porch doing it. He looked at her. I'll be outside the office. She looked at him, the flat, patient face, the worn holster, the scar over his eye, and she recognized the particular quality of what he was saying. It was not performance. It was not gallantry in the borrowed story sense. It was a man stating a fact about what he was going to do, the way he stated all facts directly without excess. All right, she said. She went to Graves's office at 8. She reviewed the affidavit in 2 hours. It was accurate in every particular, and she told Graves so, and he sealed it and put it with the injunction packet and told her he would have the San Antonio notary review it that afternoon before the stage departed. She came out of the office, and Holt was there sitting on the bench against the building facade with his hat over his eyes in the posture of a man sleeping, which she doubted he was. She sat beside him. After a moment, "How is it?" "Good, he's filing today." She looked at the street. The morning was getting on the Calichet Street, busy with horses and foot traffic, the usual commerce of a county seat town. "Weston's going to know when it's filed." "Yes, and he'll send word to Draper." "He'll have already sent word." He pushed his hat back. His eyes in the morning light were a dark gray, she decided, the color of limestone in shadow. "Draper knows everything Weston knows. The question is what he does about it." With the injunction filed, interference with the federal case is a separate federal offense. Draper doesn't think that way. He thinks in terms of what he can manage. He looked at the street. His management style has worked for 20 years in Burnett County because the county's instruments are his instruments. Federal's different. He may not have calibrated to it yet. She thought about that, about Hollis Draper in his office in Harlan's Crossing reading Weston's wire and what his calculation would look like. She had been in a position she had sent messages for him, had been in his presence at social occasions during the engagement to understand something about how he thought. He was not stupid. He was a man who had operated for 20 years without meaningful opposition, which could make a man less agile than his intelligence warranted. "He'll try to discredit the affidavit," she said. "He'll go after the source, not the content. If he can establish that I had a personal grievance, the broken engagement, he can argue I fabricated the record." Holt was quiet for a moment. "Can he?" "The messages are real. Anyone who reviews the original telegraph logs will find them." She paused. "But the original logs are in the depot at Harlan's Crossing, which Draper controls. He could destroy them." "He could, but destroying them after the federal inquiry is opened is obstruction of a federal proceeding." She looked at the street. "He may not know that yet. Or he knows and doesn't care. Or that." She was quiet. "If he destroys the logs, it actually helps us. It proves consciousness of guilt." Holt looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression that she was learning to read as the closest he came to open amusement, a quality of settled attention, a slight increase in stillness, as though he were holding something that pleased him. "You've been thinking about his moves for a while." 4 months, she said. "What's his next move after the logs?" "The witnesses, the 3 men who testified I was at the barn." She paused. "Except 2 of them are Draper employees, and one of them is the sheriff's brother-in-law. If any of them recants, the recantation itself is evidence." She looked at him. "Also Ruiz, the sheep herder. If Draper knows about the Ruiz affidavit—" "He doesn't. The Rangers held it close." Holt's voice had a particular quality on that sentence, something that told her the Rangers' discretion on that point had cost someone effort. She looked at him. "You know someone in the Ranger office?" "My captain, from when I was on the force." He said it without inflection. "He's been running the Burnett County Review on his own time because he thinks the warrant is crooked and he's not wrong." She had not known he'd been a Ranger. She thought about that, the worn holster, the economy of his movement, the way he'd assessed every room and person they'd entered, the way a man does when that's been his professional habit for years. It fit. "Why did you leave the force?" A pause. "My father's land. When Draper started moving on the Perdido Creek properties, I left to fight it." He turned the hat brim in his fingers again. "Spent 8 months trying to get the county to review the tax assessments. Got nowhere. Decided to go for the federal channel." He looked at his hands. "The barn burning was Draper's answer to my filing a complaint with the General Land Office. Convenient timing. He framed you to get you off the federal track. Got me off it for 6 months while the warrant was active." He looked at her. "You got back on it." She looked at the street. The morning sun was getting serious, the Calichet throwing back the light, the air starting to smell of dust and hot stone. "I got on it," she said. "You were already on it. We arrived at the same place. From different directions." He was quiet for a moment. A horse went past, blowing through its nostrils. "Yes," he said. "Different directions." Graves filed the injunction that afternoon. Clara stood at the stage depot and watched the San Antonio stage pull out the packet inside the strongbox and felt the thing behind her sternum release the rest of the way. It was done. The legal process would take months, the injunction hearing the indictment review the district judge's ruling on the warrant. She understood that. She had been in the information business long enough to know that the filing was not the resolution. But it was the point of no return, and she had been working toward a point of no return for 4 months, and now she was on the other side of it. She turned from the stage depot and found Holt beside her, his hands in his coat pockets, looking down the street in the direction the stage had gone. "It's moving," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "What are you going to do now?" She had not answered this question yet, even to herself. She looked at the street, the late afternoon light on the caliche, the live oaks casting long shadows, the courthouse brick going warm gold in the sun. "I need to find work," she said. "There's a telegraph office here. I'll ask about a position." "Uvalde's not big." "Big enough for a wire." He was quiet. "If the Draper situation gets loud, you'll want somewhere that's not in the blast radius." She looked at him. "Where would you put that somewhere?" He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face that she recognized from the 2 days in Graves' office, the calculation working, but also something else. Something she hadn't named yet, because she'd been too occupied with the injunction to look at it directly. "I'm going to look at that Frio section," he said. "Write it, before I decide whether to make a formal filing on it." He paused. "You'd see more of the territory than Uvalde." She looked at him. He was looking at the street. "How long a ride?" she said. "Day and a half. Back in 3. She thought about this. She thought about it quickly, the way she made all consequential decisions, not because she rushed, but because she had a habit of doing the necessary thinking before she opened her mouth, so that when she spoke it was the answer and not the preview of the answer. "I'll need to tell Cressida where I'm going," she said. He nodded. "And I'll want to leave word with Graves, in case he needs us for anything on the affidavit." "That's sensible." She looked at him, this lean, careful, honest man with limestone-colored eyes and his father's survey map in his coat, and she made a decision that was partly practical and partly something she didn't have a clean word for, and decided it didn't need one right now. "Day after tomorrow," she said. "If the horses are ready." "They'll be ready," he said. He walked back toward the hotel. She watched him go, and she told herself she was noting the quality of his stride, the unhurried forward lean, the way he moved like a man who knew where he was going and wasn't in a hurry to prove it for entirely practical reasons. She almost believed it. The ride to the Frio section took a day and a half as promised, through country that changed character as they went west, the cedar and limestone giving way to a more open scrubland, the Calichet Road becoming a ranch track, and then a series of game trails that Holt navigated without apparent difficulty, stopping occasionally to check the survey map or to look at a feature of the terrain that he identified by name or by number from his father's annotations. He was a different man on a horse than he was at a table. She had noticed that about men. Sometimes the way a particular environment located them in themselves made them more present, more coherent. In Graves's office, he had been contained, precise, careful with his words. On the trail, he talked more or differently, not less economical, but more willing to follow a thought to its end. He told her about the Perdido Creek Valley, the way it looked at dawn, when the mist came off the water and the cedar wrens were making their noise, and the whole thing had a quality of being entirely itself, indifferent to everyone looking at it. He told her about his father teaching him to read water, not the water itself, but the land around it, the way the vegetation pattern told you where the reliable sources were, and where the seasonal ones were, and where the dry holes were that would cost a man a day's effort and give him nothing. She listened. She had grown up in a city, and the land was still new to her in the way of things you've started learning and haven't finished enough to follow, but not enough to lead, which was an honest position, and one she found she didn't mind occupying. She asked questions that were sometimes basic, and he answered them without making her feel the basicness of them, which was the thing she noticed. "The cedar in that draw," she said, pointing. "Why is it taller than the cedar on the flat above it?" "Water. The draw collects runoff, and the root systems go deeper there." He looked at it. "You'd see the same pattern on the East Ridge, taller, denser stands, wherever there's subsurface water." He glanced at her. "You're looking for the pattern." "I usually look for the pattern. It's how you read telegraph messages." She looked at him. He was watching the draw, not her, which she had learned was when he was most likely to say something she wanted to think about afterward. How do you mean? In a message, the pattern is the thing. Individual words are just notation. The meaning is in the arrangement. He looked at her then. You read 17 different messages across 4 months and recognized that they were one message in different pieces. She had not thought about it that way. She had thought about it as evidence, discrete pieces of documentation. But what he was describing was different, and it was accurate. Yes, she said. That's the same thing as reading country. Individual features are just notation. He looked back at the draw. The meaning is in the arrangement. She rode beside him and thought about that. They made camp that evening at the edge of the river section, a fold in the ground where a stand of live oaks gave shade and the tributary ran clean and shallow over a limestone shelf. Holt built a fire with the efficiency of a man who did not perform fire building, but simply did it, and she sat on a flat rock and listened to the creek and the cedar wrens beginning to settle for the night, and felt something she had not felt in longer than she could account for stillness. Not the managed stillness of 4 months of careful vigilance. Something else. The kind that came from being in a place that was simply itself without any particular requirement of her. It's good land, she said. He was on the other side of the fire looking at the survey map in the last of the light. Yes. The water is reliable. 11 months. In a dry year, maybe 9. He looked up. The spring on the upper section never fails. It's a limestone aquifer. But the creek drops in August and September most years. What would you plant? He was quiet for a moment. Sorghum, maybe. Not corn too dry for corn in a bad year. And cattle mainly. Maybe 30 head to start. He folded the map. What do you know about cattle? Less than you. I know what I've learned in the last 4 months from reading freight manifests and ranch transfer documents. She paused. I know the price per head at the San Antonio market, and I know what a carrying capacity calculation looks like, and I know that water access is the binding constraint on a hill country operation. He looked at her across the fire. The light moved over his face. That's not nothing. No, it's not. She looked at the creek. I know the telegraph rates and the land office filing fees, and I can read a survey plat. She paused. I know how to keep books. My father ran a dry goods operation for 20 years, and he taught me to keep his accounts before I was 12. He was very quiet. I'm not offering anything, she said. She kept her voice even and practical because it was true she was not offering anything. She was laying information on a table the way she always laid information. I'm just saying what I know. I understand that. His voice was quiet, but I'm also hearing it. She looked at the fire. The cedar crackled. Somewhere down the creek, a nighthawk made its thin electronic call. The stars were coming out above the live oaks, pressing down to the western horizon the way they did out here, where there was nothing between you and the sky. Tell me something true, she said. It was the thing she'd found herself wanting with him from almost the beginning, not information which she could get from documents and records, but the particular quality of honesty that was not performance. About this place. About what you want it to be. He was quiet for a long moment. She heard him shift on his rock the creak of boot leather. My father worked 30 years and built something that lasted a day after the auction, he said. 3 men with false documents undid 30 years in an afternoon. He looked at the fire. I don't want to build the same thing the same way. I want to know why it held and why it didn't. He paused. The land held. The land is the same as it was. What didn't hold was the record of it, the documentation, the legal protection. He looked up at her. You spend 4 months building a record, and now a federal case is going to stand on it. The thing that endures is the record. She thought about that. You want to build the record first. I want the claim filed correctly, the water rights registered, the survey recorded in the federal archive. He looked at the creek. Then I build on that. She understood this. It was her own thinking arrived at from a different direction. The evidence first, she said. Yes. And then the thing itself. He looked at her across the fire. Yes, he said. She looked at the live oaks and the creek and the stars going brilliant above the western hills, and she thought, this is a place where a person could build something. Something documented and legal and real with water access and sorghum and 30 head in accounts kept in a ledger. She thought about what she'd been building toward for 14 months and what she'd actually built, in the difference between them, and she thought about what she would choose now if she were choosing freshly without the weight of what she'd already committed to. She thought about that for a long time in the firelight. She did not say any of it aloud, but she thought he heard it anyway, which was the most alarming thing and also the most clarifying. They rode back to Uvalde on the second day through a heat that had opinions about everything. The Texas summer had arrived fully while they were out at the Frio section, the kind of heat that pressed down on the hill country like a hand bleaching the sky to white above the western ridges, pulling the moisture out of the cedar and leaving a resin smell that was sharp and clean and faintly like turpentine. Clara rode beside Holt and drank from her canteen at intervals and did not complain about the heat, partly because complaining was not useful, and partly because there was something about the land under that extreme light. The limestone going white-hot, the live oaks casting dense, precise shadows that she found against expectation beautiful. She said so. Holt looked over at her with that almost expression, the card deck rearranging. City people usually don't take to the summer. I'm not most city people. No, he said. You're not. She looked at the road ahead. What does that mean? It means most people I've ridden with in this heat are either complaining or they've gone quiet in the way that means they're saving themselves up for later complaining. He looked at the ridge. You're actually looking at it. I look at things. You look at everything, he said. It was not a criticism. It was an observation delivered the way he delivered observations, as though the fact were interesting to him, worth noting. She thought about that for a mile. My mother died when I was 8, she said. It was not what she'd intended to say, but it had come out in response to something, to the quality of being accurately observed, she thought, which she had not often experienced and which seemed to produce in her the same thing it produced when someone offered a hand you hadn't known you needed. My father ran the dry goods store and he was good at it and he was good to me, but he didn't see things. He saw the inventory and the accounts and the customers and what they needed. He was not a man who paid attention to what wasn't in front of him. She looked at the limestone ridge. So I learned to pay attention to everything, because someone had to. Holt was quiet for a moment. His horse moved under him with the easy rhythm of an animal that knew its rider. How old were you when you started at the telegraph office? 25. I'd been keeping my father's books since I was 12, and I needed to be outside the store. She paused. The wire was the first thing I'd found that was genuinely interesting. The volume of it, the variety, the way information moved. And what it told you about people. She looked at him. Yes, that. Because you'd been reading people since your mother died. She was quiet for a moment. That's an accurate way to put it. You got good at reading what wasn't being said. It was useful. It's more than useful. He looked at the road. It's what built your case. She thought about that, about the 23 messages and what she'd read in them that their authors had not intended to send. Not the content, which was damning enough on its face, but the pattern beneath the content. The rhythm of men who believed they were invisible, who had operated for so long without challenge that they'd stopped watching their own language. She had watched it for them. Draper stopped being careful, she said. That's what made it possible. He'd been operating in Burnett County long enough that he believed the county's systems were his systems. He didn't account for the wire being outside his control. He underestimated the operator. Men do. Holt looked at her, something in his face that was not quite a smile but belonged to that region. I don't, he said. She looked at the road. She could feel the heat through the back of her coat, the sun working seriously on everything it could reach. A hawk turned in the white sky above the ridge, patient and geometric. I know you don't, she said. They rode the rest of the way in the comfortable silence that she had stopped analyzing and started simply inhabiting, and when they came into Uvalde in the late afternoon, the light was going gold on the courthouse brick, and the live oaks were casting their long shadows, and it looked, she thought, like a place a person could be for a while. The news from Cressida was waiting at the hotel desk. It was a note in Cressida's practical hand, folded once no envelope. Clara read it in the lobby while Holt dealt with the horses at the stable. The district judge in San Antonio had received the injunction packet. Graves had a telegram confirming receipt and scheduling a hearing for the following month. The case was in the federal system. There was a second paragraph. Miles Draper had come to Uvalde. He was at the Cattleman's Hotel on the south end of the street, had arrived that morning, and had been to see Graves at his home that afternoon. Graves had turned him away, but Cressida thought Clara should know. Clara folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. She sat in the lobby chair and thought about Miles Draper. The easy smile, the borrowed ring, the 14 months in which she had been building a life in his family's orbit without knowing the ground plan of what she was standing on. She tried to be fair. Miles was not his father. He was a man who had grown up in his father's operation and absorbed its assumptions the way children absorb everything through proximity and repetition without being required to examine them. That was not innocence, and it was not guilt exactly. It was a particular kind of unawareness that she found she could no longer afford to be around. She thought about what she would say if he found her. She had been thinking about this since the stage north from Vaca Springs, and she had the words. She had always had the words eventually. What she hadn't had until the last 4 days was the clarity about what the words needed to accomplish. Not an argument, not an explanation. A statement of fact. Holt came into the lobby from the back stairs, which meant he'd come through the stable. He looked at her face and did not ask the question aloud. She handed him the note. He read it. He handed it back. His face was the careful face, but there was something in the set of his jaw. Miles Draper, she said. The eldest son. The one I was engaged to. I know who he is. He sat in the chair across from her. What does he want? I don't know. Possibly to persuade me to recant. Possibly to recover the ring. She paused. Possibly just to see where things stand. Will you see him? She thought about that. I think I have to. If I avoid him, he'll interpret it as fear, and fear is information. It tells him there's something to press on. She looked at Holt. It's better to be seen clearly and let him read what's there. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid of him. No. She was not performing the no. It was simply true. Miles Draper was not a frightening man. He was a man whose father was frightening, which was different. I'm tired of performing around him. I'd rather finish it. Do you want me there? She thought about this carefully. Not in the room, she said. But I'd like to know you're nearby. He nodded once. That was that. Miles found her the next morning. She was not hiding. She'd told Cressida where she was having breakfast, and Cressida had told Graves, and Graves had apparently mentioned to someone that Clara Voss was at the hotel dining room at 7, and the information had traveled the way information did in a town of this size. He came in at 7:30. He was still handsome. She had always noticed this without particular feeling, the way you noticed a good horse or a well-built fence as a fact about the thing rather than a recommendation of it. He was wearing a traveling coat, and his hat was in his hand, and his face had the expression of a man who had prepared a speech and was uncertain of its reception. She did not stand when he came in. She waited. He sat across from her, which she had not invited but had anticipated. He looked at her hands, at the table, at her face. Clara, he said. Miles. A pause. I'm not here for my father. I know you believe that. She kept her voice even. What are you here for? He looked at the table. His hat was on his knee, held with both hands. She noticed this, and she noticed that it was the same gesture Holt used. And she noticed the difference between the two men doing it. Holt doing it because his hands needed something to do, while his mind was working. Miles doing it because it was a posture of contrition he had observed somewhere and reproduced. I want to understand what happened, he said. What happened is that your father used the county's legal instruments to strip 17 families of their land and water rights, and I documented it, and I filed the documentation with the federal land office. She picked up her coffee. That's what happened. The engagement was separate. She set the cup down. Miles, I'm going to be honest with you because I think you're capable of hearing it, and because I don't have the patience for the alternative. She looked at him directly. I came to Harlan's Crossing for a position. The position was good. The situation around it was not. I made a decision about you based on what I knew, and what I knew was incomplete. She paused. The decision was a mistake. Not because of your character, because the information was wrong. He was quiet, something in his face that might have been genuine feeling. You liked me. I did, that was real. She kept her voice steady. I also didn't love you. I decided that was something that came with time, and I was willing to wait for it. She looked at him. I'm no longer willing to wait for it. He was quiet for a long moment. The ring. I'll send it when I'm settled somewhere. She looked at him. I kept it because I needed the $40. I'll send it. He looked at the table. He looked up. Something in his face had changed. The prepared speech abandoned something rawer underneath it. "He's going to fight this," he said. "My father. He has people in the land office in Austin. He has people in Burnett County. The land office in Austin is federal, and the federal case is in the district court in San Antonio." She kept her voice level. "He can fight it. That's his right. But the record is filed, and the record is accurate, and the witnesses are real, and none of that changes." Miles was quiet. "Miles." She softened her voice a fraction, not out of pity, but out of what she actually felt, which was something adjacent to sorrow for the shape of the thing, a man whose father had built him into a building with no exits. "You should think about your own position, about what you knew and when you knew it. If the indictment proceeds, a federal prosecutor is going to ask you those questions." He looked at her. His face was young, suddenly younger than she'd seen it. "What do I do?" "Get yourself a lawyer who is not your father's lawyer," she said, "and be honest with him." He stood up. He put his hat on. He looked at her one more time with an expression she thought might take him years to understand. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "I believe you mean it." He left. She sat with her coffee and the empty dining room and thought about what she'd just done, which was, she understood the same thing she'd been doing for 4 months, making the record accurate, closing the gap between what was true and what was being performed. She felt steady, not triumphant, just steady. Holt was in the hallway when she came out. He'd been there the whole time. She understood from the position he was standing in, close enough to hear if the tone changed far enough not to intrude. He looked at her and read her face the way he read everything accurately without being asked. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He looked down the hall in the direction Miles had gone. His jaw was the hard line she'd seen at the fence rail in Graves' office when something had cost him. "He give you any trouble?" "No." She looked at him. "Were you worried he would?" A pause. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, flat, honest. She thought about that, the honesty of it, the simplicity. The fact that he had not dressed it up or made it smaller than it was. He'd been worried and he'd stayed outside the door, and he'd said so directly. "Thank you," she said, "for being there." He nodded once. He looked at the floor and then at her. "The Frio section," he said. "I'm going to file on it. The homestead application." He paused. "The hearing for the injunction is next month. I'll need to be back in Uvalde for that. Between now and then, the section needs work." She looked at him. "I'm not asking anything," he said. It was exactly what she had said to him at the fire, and she recognized it, the mirror of it, and something in her chest registered the recognition. "I'm telling you what I'm doing." "That's honest," she said. "It's all I've got." He held her gaze. 40 acres and a creek and a case in federal court. "And your father's survey map," she said. Something came into his face, the thing she'd seen at the river crossing in the noon heat at the kitchen table in Graves' house across the fire at the Frio section. Not the practiced expression, the real one, unguarded, belonging only to him. "And my father's survey map," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what she was going to do next, and about what she wanted to be true, and about the distance between those two things which she'd been measuring all her life, and about what it meant to stand in a hotel hallway in Uvalde, Texas, with a man who had in 4 days looked at her more accurately than anyone in the previous 14 months. "I can keep books," she said, "and file survey plats, and read a homestead application for errors before it goes to the office." She kept her voice even and practical. "I'd want wages for it, and I'd want to know exactly what the work is before I agree to it." He was very still. "I'm not offering anything other than labor," she said. "I want that clear." "It's clear," he said, quietly, without ceremony. "And I'll make my own housing arrangements." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The hallway was entirely quiet. "When do you file?" she said. "Tomorrow morning." She nodded. "I'll want to read the application tonight. Bring it to dinner." He almost smiled. 7 o'clock, he said. 6:30, she said. He left. She stood in the hallway and looked at the wall and breathed carefully and told herself that she had made a practical decision about a clear situation. She almost managed it. The summer in the hill country came down hard the week they arrived at the Frio section. The tent was adequate for sleeping, and the creek was clean, and the limestone shelf made a reasonable cooking surface once Holt had leveled it with a chisel. They set up camp on the high ground above the water access. She had chosen the location herself after examining the flood marks on the live oak bark, because the high ground was drier and the flood season was not done yet, even in the heat. Holt had looked at the flood marks. He had looked at her. He had moved the camp. She had not said, "I told you so," because it was not necessary to say, and because she was busy with the filing cabinet she'd brought from Uvalde in the wagon, a battered tin affair that had cost her $6 at Cressida's general store, in which she'd spent the first evening organizing one drawer for the homestead documents, one for the water rights application, one for the ongoing correspondence with Graves about the injunction hearing. "You bought a filing cabinet," he said. "The documentation needs to be organized. We don't have walls. We have a wagon and a good canvas covering and 3 spring clamps." She fitted the top drawer back in. "The documentation doesn't need walls. It needs order." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as his version of delight, which was quieter than most people's delight, but no less real for that. He went back to work on the foundation stones. The homestead filing had gone to the land office in San Antonio the week before Holt's application, reviewed by Clara for errors which had found 2 measurement discrepancies in the plat description and 1 incorrect survey, bearing all corrected before the filing. The clerk at the land office had noted the accuracy approvingly, which Clara had understood to mean that the accuracy was unusual. She thought about what that said about most homestead filings and decided not to think about it too much. The work at the section was the kind of work that had no single large achievement and 100 small ones. They cut drainage channels in the upper section to direct the spring runoff away from the foundation they were building. They staked the fence lines, and she held the survey rod while he measured, and she recorded the measurements in the ledger so they would match the plat exactly. They rode the perimeter 3 times in the first 2 weeks, and she learned to read the land the way he'd begun to teach her on the ride out, by the vegetation, by the water signs, by the layering of limestone that told you the age of the water table beneath. She learned things she hadn't expected to learn. She learned that early morning in the hill country smelled of cedar and damp limestone, and something clean and metallic from the creek, and that this smell was different from any city smell she'd known in a way that made city smells seem complicated, and this one seemed like the real thing. She learned that silence at 5 in the morning was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different set of sounds. Nighthawks finishing, mockingbirds beginning the creek's particular note over the limestone shelf, the horses moving in the rope corral. She learned that Holt woke before 5 every morning without an alarm and was already at the creek when she came out, crouched at the water's edge, looking at something she couldn't see, and that he would tell her what he'd seen if she asked and not otherwise. She asked, generally. He'd seen a ringtail on the far bank, a pair of wood ducks that suggested the water table was higher than the surface flow, implied a crayfish die-off that told him the water temperature was running hot, and they'd need to monitor the cattle's creek access in August. She wrote these observations in the ledger. He looked at what she wrote and said nothing, but she caught him reading it twice and thought that meant something. The day the foundation stones were laid and chinked to his satisfaction, he straightened up from the last course and looked at the ground plan for a long time without speaking. She came and stood beside him and looked at it too. 2 rooms, she said. To start. He wiped his hands on his work trousers. The east room is the kitchen. West is sleeping. He paused. The porch faces south, cross ventilation in summer. She looked at the footprint of the house in the limestone and cedar landscape and thought, this is where something starts. Not finished, not safe yet, but started. It's a good plan, she said. It's a starting plan. He looked at her sideways. Room to add to the north when it's warranted. She looked at the layout again. The north addition would require demolishing the current north wall, and reframing it would be significant work. It would only make sense if there was reason to need more space. She looked at him. He was looking at the foundation. That's a long-term calculation, she said. Yes, he said. He didn't elaborate. He picked up the chisel and went to work on the next course. She stood at the foundation a moment longer and thought about long-term calculations and the particular nature of a man who made them quietly without announcement and expected you to read them the same way he read the country, by looking at the arrangement, not waiting to be told what it meant. She went to update the ledger. That evening she sat by the fire with the accounts spread across her knees in the creek, talking over the limestone shelf and the stars doing their enormous Texas thing above the live oaks, and Holt was on the other side of the fire mending a cinch strap with the focused patience of a man whose hands knew what to do while his mind was elsewhere. She had come to know his silence well enough to know when his mind was elsewhere, and where it usually was on the land on the case, on the calculation of what was possible against what was likely. He was not a man who spent time on what couldn't be changed. He spent time on what could. She thought about that and about what she'd spent the last 4 months on, and she thought they were the same kind of person in that respect, which was the most clarifying thing she'd found in a while. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone," she said. He looked up from the cinch strap. He looked at her across the fire. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, which was his right and which she would have accepted. "I was afraid," he said. "When the warrant came out and I couldn't do anything about it and the federal channel was closed off, I was afraid that the land was just gone, that there wasn't a way back." He looked at the fire. Not the property, the way things should have been, the fair accounting of it. He was quiet again. "I don't like being afraid. I'm not sure I'm good at it." "You're better at it than you think," she said. "You stayed in the process. You didn't do anything that would close off your options." "Came close." He looked at the cinch. "The night I found out the warrant was issued, I rode to Harlan's Crossing intending to have a conversation with Hollis Draper that would have gone badly for everyone." He paused. "Decided against it when I got to the edge of town. Rode home." She thought about that, the particular cost of that ride home, of turning the horse back when everything in him must have been pushing forward. "That was the right call." "I know it was." He looked at her. "Doesn't mean it was easy." "The right calls rarely are." He was quiet. The fire settled. "You made a right call for 4 months, he said. "That's different from one night." 4 months of small right calls, she said. "It's easier to make the small ones. You don't feel each one as much. But you kept making them. I didn't have a better option." She looked at the fire. The evidence was the thing. Without the evidence, everything else was just complaint. She paused. "My father used to say, 'Don't tell me you're wronged, show me the ledger.'" He was quiet for a moment. Smart man. He was. She looked at the stars. He would have liked this place. He liked land that was working on something. "Working on something," he repeated. He thought the best land was land that was in the middle of becoming what it was supposed to be. Not finished. In process. She looked at the foundation stones pale in the firelight. He said finished land was just scenery. Holt was very still. "He'd have liked this," she said again. "I wish I'd known him," Holt said. Simply, no performance in it. She felt that land somewhere under her breastbone, the warmth of it, and the ache of it at once, which was the particular combination she'd been navigating since the Blanco River crossing, in which she'd been careful and deliberate about not speaking aloud. She was going to have to speak it aloud eventually. Not tonight. Tonight she had the ledger and the accounts and the fire and the creek and the clean, sharp smell of cedar resin, and it was enough. More than enough. She was not afraid. She noticed this with the same precision she noticed everything, something much larger and more complicated than afraid, which was going to need attention eventually. She put it in a ledger of its own and closed the cover for now. In the morning, she would do what came next. She was good at that. Dude. The injunction hearing in San Antonio was in late August, and it went badly on the first day. They'd ridden in 2 days before Clara, with the filing cabinet's contents transferred to a locked dispatch case, Holt with the ranger documentation, and the Ruiz affidavit, both of them in the good clothes they'd brought from Uvalde, because a federal courtroom was a federal courtroom, and the presentation of evidence included the presentation of the people who carried it. Graves had been there ahead of them at his hotel with his own case files and the exhausted look of a man who had been sleeping 3 hours a night for a month. The district judge was a man named Fairchild, older, careful, with the particular quality of judicial attention that meant he was following everything and committing none of his conclusions aloud. That was not bad. That was, Clara thought, what you wanted in a judge hearing a case this politically complicated. What was bad was Draper's lawyer. He was a man named Covington from Houston who wore his suit with the confidence of someone who understood that suits were weapons, and he had spent the 2 weeks since the injunction filing building a case that Clara had anticipated in its general shape, but not in its specific construction. He did not attack the content of the telegraph messages. He attacked the method of their acquisition. He stood before Judge Fairchild and argued with precise and well-sourced citations that a telegraph operator had a professional and legal duty of confidentiality to the messages she transmitted, and that Clara's copying of those messages into a personal ledger was a breach of that duty, and that evidence obtained in breach of professional duty was tainted and should be excluded from the federal record. It was she admitted to Holt that evening in the hotel restaurant, a good argument. It's wrong, he said. It's legally arguable, which is different from being right but is what matters in a courtroom. She ate her bread and thought. The telegraph confidentiality doctrine was developed to protect personal and commercial communications. It was not developed to protect communications that document criminal conspiracy. She looked at him. The question is whether Fairchild will distinguish the principle from its application. Will he? I don't know. He's careful. Careful judges go either way. She looked at her plate. Covington is betting that Fairchild is a formalist, that he'll apply the rule without regard to the facts underneath it. What's the counter-argument? That the confidentiality doctrine cannot be used as a shield to protect illegal activity conducted through the wire. She looked up. I need to talk to Graves tonight. They found Graves at his hotel awake and already writing. He had anticipated the Covington argument. He was not a man who was easily surprised even when things went badly, and he had a counterfiling prepared. He and Clara worked through it until 11 o'clock with Holt sitting at the table's edge, saying little but catching 2 errors in the legal citations that would have been embarrassing in the morning. Graves looked at him. You read law. I read everything that comes across my desk. 10 years as a ranger. He looked at the citation. Texas Penal Code Title 8, the conspiracy statute. It's relevant. Graves incorporated it. The second day was better. The ranger captain, a man named Tidwell, who had ridden 6 hours from Austin for the express purpose of testifying, gave his account of the arson investigation with the professional clarity of a man who understood that his credibility was the credibility of the institution he represented. Ruiz's affidavit was entered into the record over Covington's objection, which Fairchild overruled with a terseness that suggested he had thought about the issue and was done thinking about it. Clara testified in the afternoon. She had been in the process of preparing for this for 4 months, and it showed. She answered each question precisely with the dates and times from memory, the exact language of each message, the cross-reference to the county register entry that corresponded to it. Covington cross-examined for 2 hours. She did not give him anything. She answered what was asked and nothing beyond it, and corrected 2 attempts to mischaracterize her testimony with the calm of a woman who had the original documents and knew exactly what they said. At one point, Covington said, Miss Voss, you were engaged to Miles Draper. Isn't it true that this testimony is motivated by personal grievance following the termination of that engagement? She looked at him steadily. The engagement ended because I uncovered evidence of a systematic criminal enterprise operated by his father. The sequence is relevant. I did not build the case because of the engagement. The case is what ended the engagement. Fairchild made a note. She came off the stand after 2 hours and sat in the gallery behind Graves and felt the particular exhaustion of sustained, precise attention, the kind that left no room for anything approximate. Her hands were steady. Her voice had stayed level throughout. She did not look at Holt until she was seated, and when she did, she found him looking at her with an expression she had come to know, the real one, unguarded, the one that was his and no one else's. She looked at the front of the courtroom. She was going to need to deal with that expression eventually. She had put it in the ledger with everything else, and the ledger was getting full. Fairchild reserved judgment for 2 weeks. They rode back to the Frio section and went back to work. The walls of the house were half-up limestone block on the lower courses. Rough lumber above the roof trusses, waiting on the ground for the walls to reach them. The work was better after San Antonio, or she was better at it. There was something about the hearing that had resolved a tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders for 4 months, and the absence of it made physical work easier. She learned to square a wall with a plumb line. She learned to read the limestone courses for the ones that would cut clean and the ones that would split crooked. She had strong hands. She'd known that from 6 years at a telegraph key, and the work used them differently, but used them fully. And at the end of each day, she was tired in a way that felt like something accomplished, rather than something endured. Holt worked beside her, and neither above her nor below her, which she had noticed about him from the beginning and continued to notice. He had opinions about the order of things, and he stated them as opinions. And when she had a different opinion, he listened to the reasoning, and either changed his mind or explained why he didn't. And either way, the explanation was accurate, and she could follow it. They argued twice in the first 3 weeks. The first argument was about the kitchen window placement. She wanted it east-facing for morning light, and he wanted it south-facing for cross-ventilation. And they stood in the half-built kitchen in the morning heat, and neither of them was wrong, which was what made it an argument rather than a correction. They compromised on a south-facing window with a wide overhang to manage the summer light and an east-facing ventilation slot above the door. The second argument was about the cattle. He wanted to start with 20 head, which he said was the sensible number for their water access and current grazing. She had done the calculations yield per head carrying capacity on 40 acres, with the spring supplementing creek water in August. The San Antonio market price, the cost per head at the current Uvalde cattle sale, and she said 32 head was the break-even number if they wanted to be operating in the black at end of first year. He looked at her numbers. He said, the carrying capacity calculation assumes the spring stays at current flow through September. If it drops, we're overextended. She said, the spring hasn't dropped below 2/3 flow in any September on record. I looked at the county water survey. He was quiet. You looked at the county water survey, he said, last week, when you were cutting lumber. She showed him the page she'd copied from the survey. It's in the filing cabinet. He looked at the page. He looked at her. He bought 32 head at the Uvalde cattle sale the following Thursday. She did not say I told you so because it wasn't necessary. What she said when he came back from the sale with the herd moving behind him and the dust of them visible from half a mile was, the east pastures grazed. Move them to the creek pasture tonight. He moved them to the creek pasture. The third week of September brought a letter from Graves. Fairchild had ruled. He had ruled in Graves' favor on the confidentiality question. The evidence was admissible, and he had issued the federal injunction on all 17 Perdido Creek properties, freezing every Draper Land Company transfer on the drainage pending the indictment hearing. He had also referred the forgery and tax fraud charges against Hollis, Draper, and Cabot to the federal prosecutor in Austin. Holt read the letter standing at the wagon, and Clara watched his face. He did not say anything. He folded the letter and put it in his coat. He looked at the eastern pasture where the 32 head were moving through the dry grass with the slow purpose of cattle in afternoon heat. Your father's land, she said. Still Draper's land. The injunction freezes it. He can't sell it or transfer it, but it doesn't restore it. He looked at the horizon. The recovery proceeding takes years, maybe 3, maybe 5. But it starts now. Yes, he looked at her. It starts now. She looked at the cattle. The late afternoon light was doing what it did in September in the hill country, going amber and serious, the shadows long, the cedar going dark at the edges. It was, she thought, a good time of day in a good kind of place. What will you do if they restore it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'll have to think about that when I get there. He looked at her. Right now I've got 40 acres in 32 head and 4 walls and a roof going up. And a filing cabinet. And a filing cabinet, he said with the quality that was his version of a smile. She looked at the filing cabinet in the wagon, its tin sides reflecting the amber light. She had organized it 3 times now, and it was exactly right. Homestead documents, alphabetical by type water rights, cross-referenced correspondence with Graves chronological. Holt, she said. He looked at her. She had been thinking for 3 weeks about what she was going to say. She had drafted it in her head with the same care she drafted affidavits. The precise language, the correct order of the facts. Nothing approximate or borrowed from other people's stories. I know you haven't said anything, she said. I know you've been careful about it. I want you to know that I've noticed you being careful, and I understand why you've been careful, and I am... She stopped. She was not a woman who fumbled for words, but she was fumbling now, which she recognized was information. I am not as certain as I was in Uvalde about what I want from this arrangement. He was very still. When I said I wanted wages and housing arrangements, she said that was accurate at the time. She looked at the cattle. I've been revising the calculation. Clara. She looked at him. His face was the real one, the unguarded thing that was only his. You don't have to say it in a way that sounds like a legal brief, he said. She was quiet. Just say it, he said, quietly. Not a demand, an invitation. She looked at him across the wagon and the filing cabinet in the amber light. This lean, careful, honest man who had bought 32 cattle because she'd done the math, and who read her silences the way she read country, and who had been watching her with the quality of attention that she'd been cataloging for months without quite admitting what the catalog was about. I don't want to leave, she said. It was not the whole of it, but it was the start, and it was true without qualification. I've been thinking about what comes next, and every version I make of what comes next has this land in it. These walls, this creek. She paused. You. He was quiet for a long time. The cattle moved. The cedar wrens started their evening argument in the live oaks. I've got nothing to offer you that's established, he said. The case is going to take years. The land recovery is uncertain. The 40 acres is 40 acres. I know what the 40 acres is. She met his eyes. I've been keeping the accounts. Something came into his face, something she'd seen once at the fire when she'd talked about her father. Unguarded. Entire. I love you, he said. The words were simple and unhurried, set down the way he set down everything important, without performance, without the borrowed language of other people's stories. I think I have since the Blanco River crossing when you drank out of your hand and told me you noticed horses. Maybe before. He shook his head. Doesn't matter when. She felt the warmth of it go through her like water through limestone, finding every crack settling into the deep places. Holt, she said, I know what you're going to say. The position, the arrangements. I'm going to say yes, she said. He stopped. I'm going to say that I am done making decisions based on what is reasonable without what is real. She kept her eyes on his. I spent 14 months making decisions on the wrong information. I have better information now. She looked at him steadily. I know who you are. I've been reading the evidence for 3 months and the evidence is clear. He looked at her for a long moment with that face, the real one unguarded, belonging only to this moment. Yes, he said. Is there a different answer you were expecting? He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and she did not move back, and he held her face in both hands. Warm, calloused, her father's kind of hands. The hands of a man who worked beside you and not above you, and kissed her. Not careful, not provisional. A real one. The cattle moved in the amber light, and the creek talked over the limestone shelf, and the cedar wrens finished their argument, and somewhere above the live oaks, a hawk turned in the last of the day, and the hill country went on being entirely itself indifferent to the 2 people standing at the wagon, and also somehow exactly what it was supposed to be. The Draper Land Company's operation in Burnett County collapsed the following spring. The federal indictment of Hollis Draper and his Austin intermediary came down in February, and Hollis Draper, who had operated for 20 years in the confidence that the county's instruments were his instruments, found that the federal system did not adjust to him the way the county had. He had money for good lawyers. He had connections in Austin that slowed the process. He did not have a counter to 23 documented telegrams and a federal deputy surveyor who had spent his career being accurate. Miles Draper dissolved his interest in the land company in March and hired his own lawyer separate from his father's. Clara heard this from Cressida, who heard it from the San Antonio newspaper, and thought about Miles, the borrowed story. The easy smile, the ring he hadn't known was his grandmother's, and felt the particular quiet that came from a chapter actually finished. She wrote him a brief note. She sent the ring. He wrote back shorter than her note and said only you were right about the lawyer. She put the note in the filing cabinet, not because it required filing, but because the filing cabinet was where she put things that were part of the record. The Perdido Creek land recovery proceedings began in April. 17 families collectively filing for restoration of their properties through the federal process. Holt had been corresponding with Albrecht and 2 other Perdido Creek families throughout the winter, and he had spent February helping them prepare their filings, reading each application for errors the way Clara had read his, correcting the survey bearings, matching the deed descriptions to the original plat. He did not file for his own family's section. She noticed this in March and said nothing for 2 weeks, and then said, the East Fork property, you're not in the recovery filing. He was at the table with the correspondence. He looked up. No. Why? He looked at his hands. My father built it. It was his work. If it comes back as his. He paused. I've built my own. He looked around the kitchen, the walls plastered and solid, the shelves she'd put up, the curtains she'd sewn from cotton cloth, bartered for 3 hours of accounts work at Cressida's store. I'd rather have mine. She looked at him. She looked at the kitchen, the walls that had been limestone blocks in the ground 3 months ago. The shelves, the curtains, the filing cabinet in the corner with its 3 organized drawers, the ledger on the table with its columns in her hand, and his annotations in the margins. She looked at the window they'd argued about, which faced south with the wide overhang, managing the light beautifully, which she had been right about, and he had been right about, and which they'd arrived at together. Your father would understand that, she said. I think he would. He looked at the correspondence. He'd also tell me I spent too long on the legal briefs and not enough on the spring channel clearance. He'd be right, she said. I've been saying that for 2 weeks. He looked at her with the expression the real one. You've been right about most things. Most, she said. The south window, he said. We were both right about the south window. Yes. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. We were. She looked at his hand over hers, calloused, warm, familiar now, in the way of things that had become part of the daily structure of living. She looked at the table, the ledger, the window with the afternoon light coming through the overhang at exactly the angle they'd calculated. We're going to be all right, she said. He turned her hand over and looked at her palm, the calluses at the base of her fingers, the ink stain from the telegraph key that had never entirely gone. We are, he said. We have the documentation to prove it. She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, the kind that went all the way through. She covered her mouth with her other hand, but it was already done. He was still looking at her hand, and she thought she heard something in the quality of his attention that was beyond what she had a name for, yet something larger than the immediate moment reaching forward into the shape of what was coming. She thought, this is what it feels like. Not the story, the thing itself. She did not say it. She let it be what it was. Outside the window, the hill country was going about its serious afternoon business, the cattle in the east pasture, the creek over the limestone shelf, the cedar wrens beginning their argument, the hawk making its long, patient circles above the live oaks. The record was good. The foundation was solid. What they were building was theirs. They were married in October in the Uvalde courthouse, in the office of the Justice of the Peace, on a morning when the first northerly of the season had come through overnight, and the hill country was cool and sharp and smelled of cedar and rain-washed limestone. Clara had not made a new dress. She had the good dress she'd brought from Harlan's Crossing. Dark green wool, cut simply, the kind of dress that served the woman wearing it rather than competing with her, and she wore it with the pearl ring that Miles had returned by post 3 weeks after she'd sent it. She had looked at the ring when it came back, and then she had put it on her right hand where it belonged, which was where her grandmother had worn it. Holt wore his good coat and his hat and a shirt that was clean and pressed, that she had pressed herself because it needed doing, and she was faster at it than he was. They walked to the courthouse in the morning light, the pecan trees along the main street shedding their leaves in the northerly, the Caliche road pale in the thin early sun. Cressida walked with them. She had insisted on this in the way she insisted on practical necessities. Graves had sent word that he would have come if the San Antonio court hadn't scheduled a session for the same morning. Clara had written him back, "You're in the filing cabinet. That counts." He'd sent a telegram in reply, "Approved." Congratulations. She had put the telegram in the filing cabinet. The Justice of the Peace was a man named Holbrook, who had seen everything the county had to offer in 30 years of officiating and had developed from the experience an admirable economy of manner. He said what needed to be said. They said what the moment required. Cressida witnessed and signed the register, and Holbrook signed, and then it was done, and the morning was going on outside the window, with the pecan leaves coming down, and the northerly doing its work on the hill country. Clara looked at her hand, the pearl ring on the right, the simple gold band Holt's mother's, which he'd kept in the inside pocket of his coat since she'd died, and which fit as though it had been sized for Clara on the left. She looked at Holt. He was looking at her with the expression the real one, unguarded, belonging entirely to this particular moment and no other. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "We should get back." She straightened her dress. "The cattle need moving to the south pasture before the temperature drops." Cressida made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was definitely something. Holt looked at the window at the pecan leaves coming down at the courthouse walls with their serious territorial-era plaster. He looked at Clara. "The cattle can wait an hour," he said. She looked at him. "1 hour?" "1 hour," he agreed. Cressida expressed her intention to have coffee at the hotel and gave them the look of a woman who had seen everything in 50 years and was pleased to be seeing this. They walked back toward the edge of town where the live oaks started, and the northerly pushed the pecan leaves across the Caliche around their feet. And the hill country was clean and bright and serious in the October morning, the way it was always serious, the limestone going white in the thin sun, the cedar dark at the edges. She put her hand in his. His were warm. She had known they would be. This was one of the things she'd cataloged about him, among the hundreds of things she'd cataloged, and they were all still true and would keep being true, which was the most clarifying fact she possessed. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when a question was worth a real answer. "Spring," he said. "What about spring?" "The North Addition. I want to get the foundation staked before the ground freezes." He looked at the live oaks and the second water channel on the upper section. The spring output was down in September, not critical, but worth routing differently before next summer. She looked at him sideways. There was a quality in his voice she knew well, the practical surface over the other thing. The thing he let show in his face when he wasn't managing it. "That's what you're thinking about," she said. "On our wedding morning." "I'm thinking about our ranch," he said. He turned and looked at her, and the other thing was on his face, plainly clear and entire, which is the same thing. She looked at the live oaks, the limestone hills, the hill country going serious and beautiful in the October light. She thought about what she'd come to Texas for, the position, the engagement, the practical arrangement she'd made with available facts, and about what she'd actually found, which bore almost no resemblance to what she'd planned, but was more entirely right than anything she'd planned had ever been. She thought about evidence and what it proved, and about the particular quality of something you'd tested from every angle and found to be solid. She thought about her father, who had watched her mother the way a man watches something true, and about the kitchen table kind of life, and what it actually required, which was not a big house, or a wealthy man, or a respectable position, but a person who looked at you accurately and found nothing they needed to change. She thought about 23 telegraph messages, and an oilskin packet, and a river crossing in the noon heat, and a fire at the Frio section, and a foundation of limestone blocks, and 32 cattle in an east pasture, and a filing cabinet with 3 organized drawers, and about how the record of a thing was not the thing itself, but was how you knew the thing was real. She leaned against his shoulder and looked at the hills. "The North Addition," she said. "2 rooms or 1? He looked at her. "We should decide now," she said. "Before the staking, so the foundation plan is right from the start." He was very quiet for a moment. "2 rooms," he said. She nodded. She looked at the hills and the live oaks and the limestone going white in the thin morning sun, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something is built on what is real. Not finished. In process, the way her father had said good land was always in process, working on something becoming what it was supposed to be, never quite done. She was not afraid. Not because the fear was gone, because she had learned in 14 months in a stagecoach in a federal hearing room, at a fire beside a creek, laying limestone blocks in the hill country heat, that doing the thing anyway was the only way through. And because the man beside her had taught her without teaching her that the record you built was not what protected you from difficulty. It was what told you when difficulty came that you had something worth protecting. The northerly moved the pecan leaves across the caliche around their feet. The live oaks threw their small, hard shadows. The hill country was large and serious and indifferent to everything at their feet, and entirely improbably witness to all of it. She kept her hand in his. She was home. Not because of the land, though. The land was good. Not because of the 40 acres and the creek and the limestone house with its south-facing window and its filing cabinet and its ledger with 2 kinds of handwriting in it. Because of the record. The record was right. She had checked it from every angle, and it held. The kind that built things worth keeping. The kind that lasted. The North Addition went up in November before the ground hardened past working. Holt staked the foundation on the morning after their wedding, and she held the survey rod, while he measured the same way she'd held it in the beginning and recorded the measurements in the ledger, the same way she'd recorded everything. The foundation stones came from the same limestone shelf they'd quarried the house from. She'd found a seam on the east side of the property that cut cleanly, which Holt confirmed was good stone, and they'd hauled it in the wagon in 3 loads. The framing took 2 weeks. The roof went on in the 3rd week before the first real cold. On the day they sealed the roof, late November, the air carrying the first serious bite of the season, the cedar wrens gone south and the creek running low but steady. She stood in the center of what would be the north room and looked at the rafters and the south wall and the window frame waiting for its glass. 2 rooms. Holt came in behind her. She heard his boots on the rough floor. "It's good," she said. "It's solid." He came to stand beside her. They looked at the rafters together. "Glass arrives from San Antonio next week." "Good. We'll lose warmth through the frame until then." "I'll hang canvas on the south side tonight." She looked at the window frame. The late afternoon light came through it at an angle that showed the dust motes turning in the air of the new room, unhurried, going wherever they went. She watched them. "Holt," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "The room's going to need a name eventually, something to call it other than the North Room." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them in the clear November air was the thing they had both said directly, and the thing neither of them had needed to say beyond that, because some things didn't need saying past the first time. "We have time to figure that out," he said. "We do," she said. She looked at the dust motes turning in the light from the window frame, unhurried, and thought that she had not expected this, not this specific room, not this specific man, not the filing cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, or the 32 cattle in the east pasture, or the creek talking over the limestone shelf, or the way the hill country smelled at dawn. She had not expected any of it, which meant she had not been wrong about what she'd wanted. She'd just been working with incomplete information. The information was better now. She would keep better records going forward. In February, a letter came from the Federal Land Office in San Antonio. It was addressed to Holt Greer Homestead Claimant Frio Tributary Section, Uvalde County, and it was from the review panel established by the injunction order, and it said in the careful language of federal documents that the homestead claims submitted the previous August had been reviewed and found to be accurate in all particulars, and was hereby certified and entered into the federal land record. Holt read it at the kitchen table while she was at the stove. He didn't say anything. She heard the particular quality of his silence and turned. He was looking at the letter with the expression she had first seen at the Blanco River crossing. The cards being rearranged, the calculation resolving into something that might, in a different man, have been called feeling. "It's certified," she said. "Yes." He looked up at her. "As of today, it's in the federal record." She crossed the kitchen and took the letter and read it. It was accurate 23 lines of careful bureaucratic language that amounted to "This land is yours properly," with the full documentation of the federal government to say so. She handed it back. He looked at it a moment longer, and then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, the same pocket where his father's survey map had lived, and she understood what that meant and did not say anything about it because it was private and because she understood private things. She went back to the stove. "The records are good," she said. "Yes." His voice was even and quiet and contained something she did not need to name. "Your father would be glad," she said. He was quiet for a long time. She kept her back to him and let the quiet be what it was. The creek ran outside, low in February, but steady, the limestone aquifer feeding it through the dry months the way Holt had said it would. The cattle were in the south pasture 32, head and 3 new calves, the calves coming in late January when the nights were still cold, and she and Holt had taken turns at the south fence, watching for cows in difficulty. She had not let any calves die on her watch. "He'd say the documentation is the easy part," Holt said. "The hard part is what you do with what's documented." She turned. He was looking out the south window at the hill country morning, the limestone white in the early light, the cedar dark at the edges, the sky a clear hard blue that meant cold and no rain coming. "What do we do with it?" she said. He looked at her. The sun came through the south window at the angle they'd calculated, managed by the overhang, not blinding but present, filling the kitchen with the particular morning quality that only that window at that orientation at that time of year produced. They had been right about it. They had arrived at it together. "We keep the records," he said. "We work the land, we build the North Room into what it's going to be." He looked at her steadily. "We do the next thing." She thought about the next thing. About 32 cattle and 3 calves in a spring that fed reliable water through 11 months of the year, and a limestone house with 4 solid walls and a south-facing window, and 2 rooms and a filing cabinet with 3 organized drawers. About a federal certification in an inside coat pocket alongside a hand-drawn survey map. About the Perdido Creek families whose 17 properties were in the recovery proceedings slowly, with the particular slowness of federal processes that were nonetheless moving. About Graves in his San Antonio office going on being accurate. About the record that was good, and the foundation that was solid, and the thing they were building that was entirely theirs. "The spring channel clearance," she said. "You said before the ground freezes." He looked at the window. "Ground's still soft." "Then we'd better start." He stood up. He put on his hat. He looked at her. She looked at him, this man who had read 23 telegraph messages and understood what they added up to, who had turned a horse around at the edge of Harlan's Crossing and ridden home because the record was more important than the anger, who had bought 32 cattle because she'd done the math and planted his foundation because the document was right, and held her face in both hands and said, "I love you," without ceremony or borrowed language, just as a fact placed on the table between them. She put on her coat. They went outside into the February morning, into the clear, cold air that smelled of cedar and limestone in the creek, and something clean and metallic that was just the hill country being the hill country. And the sky was enormous above them, and the land ran out in every direction without apology. She did not think about where she'd come from. She thought about what was in front of her. The creek, the cattle, the spring channel that needed clearing before the planting season. The north room, the next thing and the thing after that. She put her hand in his and they started up the slope toward the spring, the hill country solid under their boots, and the morning serious and bright around them and the record good, the kind that lasted.